This set of PowerPoint notes covers specific viral diseases that I've chosen to cover in our class this semester. Again, since we're talking about specific diseases at this point, the material can be found in your textbook in chapters 21 through 26, but of course you're only responsible as far as testing for the diseases that are covered in this PowerPoint. It would be impossible for us to cover every viral disease. As we go through the viral diseases, you should be focusing on filling out your viral disease study chart. On this study chart, you'll see what's important that you understand about each disease is the etiology, which at this point, of course, is going to be a virus for each disease, the transmission, which is how you get it, and you'll see that a lot of viral diseases are spread by a respiratory route by simply breathing them in. You want to also understand the what I call landmark sign and symptom, which is how you know you have this specific viral disease and not something else. As we begin this chapter, we're going to begin in chapter 21 and pick out some of the viral diseases that affect the skin. I'm going to start with two what are called pox viruses. All pox viruses are spread by a respiratory route. You simply need to be around someone that currently has one of the pox viruses and breathing the same air as them. You are very likely to contract this virus. The first one on the slide is chickenpox. Of course, we all, for the most part, know what chickenpox are. However, depending on your age, you may or may not have ever contracted chickenpox. About 10 to 15 years ago, we began vaccinating against chickenpox. But if you are anywhere over 26, 27 years old, you probably had full-blown chickenpox when you were a kid. Chickenpox is a rash. It typically begins on either the face, the trunk, or central regions of the body, and then it typically begins to move out. Chickenpox can be very minor, which is just a simple rash on the body. The rash is very itchy, and sometimes you have a clear fluid within the papule that's found on the body. Chickenpox can get severe. The chickenpox can move down the throat into some of the digestive or respiratory organs. It can cause some serious inflammatory reactions. It can cause difficulty swallowing, difficulty breathing. So it can be much worse than just itchy discomfort. Whether or not you had full-blown chickenpox or you had the chickenpox vaccine when you were young, you all have a latent or hiding form of chickenpox virus in your body. At any point when your body becomes immunocompromised, that chickenpox virus can break back out in a disease that we will call shingles. With shingles, the chickenpox virus is going to move to the end of your sensory nerve endings, and it typically happens around one of the peripheral nerves that's coming out of the spinal cord. This is going to cause a very similar looking rash as chickenpox, but since it's in sensory nerve endings, it is going to be extremely painful. If I flip ahead to show you what this looks like, this picture here shows you the rash of chickenpox, just a small red rash. This is a child's chest region. Now this bottom down picture here, this is shingles. You can see how it's wrapping around the body. That's following one of those specific peripheral nerves. Much more painful infection. When someone has chickenpox, they can give someone else chickenpox. If someone has shingles, they can give someone chickenpox. But there is no way to give someone shingles because you have to have chickenpox before it can turn into shingles. The second pox virus on this slide is smallpox. Now currently smallpox is still considered an eradicated virus, and it's not something that we have to worry about anymore. The reason we worked so hard to eradicate smallpox is because it was a much more serious virus. Simply looking at this picture here, the vesicles themselves, you can see they're much more raised, much more of a severe rash. A lot of people had serious problems with breathing and some neurological type disorders that followed their smallpox outbreaks. Since smallpox is a much more devastating virus and we no longer vaccinate against smallpox, this is considered to be a bioterrorism threat for us. We move on to another infection of viruses that affects the skin. We can look at measles. Measles, again, is transmitted by a respiratory route. Typically, the beginning of measles is going to be a simple sore throat due to a dry cough, headache, some pretty normal symptoms. Then we're going to start to see this red rash, again, more toward the center of the body that spreads out and covers the entire body. A characteristic sign of measles are called Koplik spots. These are whitish spots that appear on the tongue. The problem with measles is it typically weakens the immune system, and following measles, a child is going to have severe complications that can arise from pneumonia, laryngitis, other secondary bacterial infections, or the worst possibility is subacute sclerosing panencephalitis. And we all remember that encephalitis is an inflammation of the brain itself, so it can be extremely severe. Measles is something that we do not see often in the United States because of an important vaccine called the MMR. The first M of the MMR vaccine keeps us from getting measles. You get a MMR vaccine when you are 12 months old, and then again at 5 years old, and then other points throughout your life depending on your choice of college, job field, and things of that nature. Unfortunately, people have began to stop vaccinating properly against measles, and a lot of very young children in the United States are beginning to contract measles, have serious complications, and even die from measles. The R of the MMR vaccine protects us from the next disease to discuss, and that's rubella. Again, rubella is transmitted by a respiratory route. This causes a rash, which is shown in the picture here. This is a very minor rash, even though it can cover the whole body, simply because it does not have very many complications. If this is such a minor disease, you should be thinking, why do we bother to vaccinate to prevent this infection? We have began vaccinating to prevent this infection to simply try to rid the world of rubella. Rubella is only dangerous as a postnatal infection among infants and a congenital infection. Rubella is known as a teratogenic virus because if a mother contracts rubella while pregnant, the baby will be born with severe birth defects. This is such a serious problem that women who are pregnant cannot get an MMR vaccine. Women who are even possibly of childbearing age are often advised very heavily against getting an MMR vaccine. Moving on to another group of viruses, the next group are the papillomas. Papillomaviruses cause warts. Very few people actually realize that warts are caused by a viral infection. There are many different types of papillomaviruses, so there's lots of variations of warts. The genital warts we'll look at when we get to the information from Chapter 26, which is diseases of the genitourinary system. With papillomaviruses, they are simply everywhere. Children typically have more outbreaks of warts than adults because their immune system is slightly weaker, and so they're going to show more of the effects of the viruses. We all have the viruses. We all come in contact with the viruses throughout our life. The viruses do not cause anything severe, just something that sometimes may not be pretty. Now, moving away from diseases of the skin, we're going to go into some diseases that can cause infections deeper inside of the body. And the first one to discuss is poliomyelitis, or more commonly called polio. Polio is transmitted by fecal contaminated water. This is the first one we've seen in this PowerPoint that is not transmitted by a respiratory route. Polio used to be a severe problem even in the United States. So we began a polio vaccination program. As the water purification became better and people were being vaccinated, we considered that we had eradicated polio from the United States. However, it started popping up again within the past 5 years, so we've started vaccinating young children again. When you first contract polio, it typically is going to cause some pretty generic symptoms such as sore throat, nausea, other gastrointestinal upsets. In very few of the cases, the virus will move into the central nervous system, and it can cause motor cell destruction as well as paralysis. If you know of anybody that was really sick when they were a child, Their legs never really completely develop properly. They have to have help walking. It's very likely that they contracted polio when they were a child. Some of the first polio vaccines were a little bit more dangerous, and there was a likelihood that you could actually get polio from the vaccine itself. However, the new vaccine has absolutely no chances of giving polio to the person being vaccinated. Infectious mononucleosis, or more commonly known as mono, is transmitted by saliva or any bodily fluid. Mono is not only caused by one particular virus. The most common virus that causes mono is called the Epstein-Barr virus. This virus is related to mono as well as many other infections, even some viral origin cancers. When you have mono, you typically have sore throat, high fever, swollen lymph nodes. The main sign or symptom that seems to differentiate mono from other diseases is a long period, sometimes up to 2 months, of just not feeling good. Most people that have mono report a fatigue that keeps them from having any energy to complete normal everyday tasks. One interesting fact about mono is it's not only spread through saliva. A lot of people that contract mono contract it through eating fruit that has not been washed properly. Now taking a look at rabies, this is the first example of a zoonotic virus that we've seen. Zoonotic implies that the virus is transmitted from animal to human or, of course, other animal. The rabies virus is transmitted through an animal bite. The reason it's transmitted through the bite is the virus is maintained in the saliva of the rabid animal. Once the rabid animal bites a human, the saliva is then penetrated by the teeth into the skin. The virus then moves through the central nervous system to the brain. It can cause all sorts of issues once the virus gets into the brain. People that die from rabies die from an inflammation or encephalitis of the brain. There are many stages of rabies, but the two most common we see are furious rabies, in which the animal or the human that has contracted rabies becomes very restless, highly excitable. And then there's paralytic rabies, where the animal becomes very lethargic, begins to just lie almost paralyzed, unaware of its surroundings. If you do get bit by an animal that is rabid, there is treatment for this disease. It's a series of very painful shots directly into the abdomen. Vaccinations for rabies can prevent the virus from multiplying once it gets into the body. So, of course, we vaccinate all of our pets. It's state law in Mississippi that dogs are vaccinated for rabies. Humans that have a constant interaction with animals can also be vaccinated against rabies. An interesting thing about the rabies virus is that it has adapted to train its host to do things that keep it more likely to be transmitted to a new host. Once the animal gets into a furious stage of rabies, where there are a lot of active rabies virus in the saliva, the person carrying the rabies begins to have muscle spasms, which in animals a lot of times begins to show as a snarl, and then it makes the animal or the person hydrophobic, which is scared of water. And if you think about it, if you were to begin drinking water, that would wash the saliva from your mouth and then wash the virus down, so it would no longer be in the mouth, in the saliva, so it could be transmitted in a bite. Next, we have a group of viruses known as the Arboviral Encephalitis. Arbovirus tells us that these are viruses that are spread by arthropods or insects. Most of the time, these are going to be mosquito-borne infections. The encephalitis tells us that these viruses cause a swelling of the brain that can be extremely severe. An example of an arboviral encephalitis that's getting a lot more press in our area is the West Nile virus. West Nile virus is a scary infection because it typically shows as very similar to a common cold when you first get it. Most of the time people do not realize they have anything more than just a cold until some swelling of the brain has already begun to happen. Similar, we have arboviral hemorrhagic fevers. These are different from the arboviral encephalitis in that these are infections that lead to uncontrolled bleeding. The bleeding is going to be from all of the mucous membranes of the body. If you've ever watched the Discovery Channel and saw images of people lying around with blood coming from their eyes or anything of that nature, they typically have a hemorrhagic fever. Now, I have two listed on this slide, but just to talk about one in particular, yellow fever has a pretty important part in our American history. Whenever the Americas were first forming and the Europeans were coming over and discovering different parts of America, a lot of times in history you'll learn about how the American Indians became very sick because they weren't used to the diseases that the Europeans were bringing with them. The disease that the Europeans were bringing with them was actually yellow fever. Yellow fever is transmitted by a mosquito. It's typically found in monkeys. So if the mosquito bites the monkey and then bites a human, the human can then get yellow fever. There are many hemorrhagic fevers. Just to show you a couple more of them, this is a list of hemorrhagic fevers that are not arboviral. They're not transmitted by a mosquito. The one on this list you've probably heard of would be Ebola. To get Ebola, you have to actually come in contact with the blood of someone that has Ebola. This slide has a lot of information on it. This slide shows you the difference between the different types of hepatitis infections. Hepatitis is a viral infection that causes inflammation of the liver. Regardless of which type of hepatitis you contract, the liver will inflame to some degree. Now, some hepatitis infections are much more severe than others. There is hepatitis A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, many of them, but they begin to show a trend after we get past the C. Hepatitis A is transmitted fecal-oral. It does not cause chronic liver disease. Whenever you have hepatitis A, this typically presents as a severe form of food poisoning that will go away on its own. Hepatitis B and C are transmitted parenteral. This means that you have to have the skin pierced some way, and then hepatitis can enter through the skin. Many years ago, it was common for hepatitis to be seen among needle users, people getting at-home tattoos, at-home piercings, things of that nature. We saw a very high incidence with the hepatitis. Both hepatitis B and C cause chronic liver disease, and there is currently no official cure for hepatitis B or C. There are a lot of treatments for the diseases, but once you contract it, you're always going to have it, and you will always be treating the disease. If you look now in the last column where it's showing you vaccines, we have a vaccine for hepatitis A, hepatitis B, but not hepatitis C. So when you go get your hepatitis shots, you could still contract hepatitis C. So it's very important to understand the difference between which ones you're protected from, which ones you are not protected from, especially if you're going to go into the healthcare field. Now taking a look at herpes. Herpes is a disease that can vary depending on which form of the virus you contract. The two most common types of herpes are herpes simplex type 1 and 2. Herpes simplex type 1 causes the very common fever blister. Herpes simplex type 2 causes genital herpes, but there are many more. Herpes type 6, for example, causes a herpes-style rash on the hands and feet. There's many different ones, but type 1 and 2 are the most common, so they get the most attention. There is no cure for genital or oral herpes. Once you get herpes, you are going to have it forever. Simplex type 1, which causes fever blisters, is spread by a respiratory route, and it's estimated that over 99% of the population all have herpes simplex type 1. Just not everyone will have a fever blister breakout. Herpes simplex type 2, or genital herpes, is spread by bodily fluid contact. Once someone contracts genital herpes, they can exhibit absolutely no symptoms or one single vesicle on the genitals, the perineum, the thigh, the buttocks, anywhere in that area, or they can have many vesicles in the area. Sometimes it is very hard to tell that someone has genital herpes simply by looking at them. Since there is no cure, once you have had a herpes outbreak, you will have another one. All medication can do is make it less likely for you to have an outbreak. This picture here shows you herpes simplex type 1, the fever blister on the mouth. This picture shows you herpes simplex type 2 on a penis. And you can see it's a very small outbreak in this particular picture, not very easy to see. Probably the most sad form of genital herpes is what can happen if a baby passes through the birth canal of a mother that has genital herpes. The baby is born with neonatal herpes and has severe issues with development as well as horrible rashes all over the body. Talking again about the human papillomaviruses, now just to take a look at the specific papillomavirus that causes genital warts. Genital warts are very similar to herpes viruses. Once you get them, they never go away. All you can have, once you get the virus never goes away. But what's different is with the wart itself is not going to go away. There really is no treatment for this, but if the warts get too severe, then you can go to a doctor and have them laser removed. So that's what's shown in this picture. All down in this region are many different genital warts. The last disease to discuss that's a viral disease is HIV. HIV, or human immunodeficiency virus, was first identified in 1981 in a homosexual man. However, this virus is not a disease of the homosexual community. You are no more likely to contract the disease as a homosexual as you are a heterosexual. It was simply first identified in this group because the group of homosexual men were typically not known for using any sort of protection when they had sex. Back in the early 80s when this was discovered, late 70s, condoms were used mainly to prevent pregnancy. If two men were together, pregnancy was not something they were having to think about, so they were having a lot of unprotected sex. Today, it is just as prevalent in the heterosexual community as it is in the homosexual community. HIV itself does not do too much to the body to cause visible signs and symptoms. With the HIV, it's causing problems on the inside of the body, and you cannot physically see the damage that's occurring. As the HIV virus begins growing in the body, it begins to kill the helper T cells. It also damages your ability to make T memory cells, which I know we did not talk about when we went over the immune system, just because I was trying to keep the immune system a little bit simpler. But what is happening is your body begins to lose the ability to regulate its immune system as well as initiate any attacks by your immune system. Once the level of T cells in the body hits a low enough level, we no longer call the disease HIV. We begin to call the disease AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. When people have contracted HIV, they can live for many, many years, as far as we know, indefinitely, with just HIV, depending on the treatment and the medication that they take. But once they move into the stage of having AIDS, those people are going to begin to deteriorate rather quickly. Most people that get AIDS do not, however, die from the virus. They die from some sort of opportunistic infection or some secondary disease such as a pneumonia that they contract. Now, at the end of the lecture, just to have a good place to put the discussion, we need to talk a little bit about prion diseases. Now, all diseases caused by prions are called transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. The more common name for the diseases are things like sheep scrapie, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, Kuru, or bovine spongiform encephalopathy. All of these are diseases caused by a prion. They get different names depending on the organism or the animal that is contracting the disease, as well as how the disease was transmitted. The history of the prion diseases begins with sheep scrapie back in some of the European countries in the 80s, actually late 80s, early 90s. They started noticing that there was something wrong with the sheep, but they had absolutely no idea what was wrong with them. Once the sheep began to go crazy, and by crazy they were physically scraping their bodies on the fence uncontrollably, the government decided that there was a disease they could not identify in the sheep, so they killed the sheep. They then ground the sheep up and used that meat, to not be wasteful, to make feed for the cattle. Then the cows began to show signs of prion infections, although again at the time they had no idea what was going on. When the cow gets a prion disease, we call it BSE, bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Now, this was happening in the 1900s, and at the time we had no idea this was also being discovered in a cannibalistic tribe in New Guinea. The people in the cannibalistic tribe that exhibited the prion disease, we called that infection kuru. It has a very long explanation of the history that I won't go into at this time. What I want you to be able to do is understand what happens to someone if they have or some animal if they have a prion infection. The person is going to have to ingest neurological matter from someone that has a prion disease, or either inherit a messed up gene and then they can develop the prion diseases themselves. The person is going to begin having brain damage that is going to lead to changes in their personality and what a lot of people consider crazy behavior. I thought I had a picture, but what typically happens is the brain cells all have a specific protein called the PR protein on the outside of the cells. When you ingest a prion, the prion then causes the brain cells to take in the prion. It then sucks in some of those PR proteins from the outside of the cell, changes them, and then puts them back on the outside of the cell. This leads to the cell becoming damaged, dying, and then you end up getting plaques or holes in the brain. So as the person eventually dies, their brain looks like a sponge because it has small holes in it. The scary thing about a prion disease is that we do not have any treatment or any possible cure for a prion disease. Even scarier, we do not have any sort of diagnosis technique. We do not know that that's what's wrong with the person or the animal until they die, and we can do a physical autopsy and look at the brain to look for the prions themselves. In a laboratory setting, prions can be destroyed, but it takes a very specific method to destroy the prions. In order to kill the prions on any sort of surgical equipment or things of that nature in a hospital setting, the equipment is soaked in extremely potent sodium hydroxide, strong enough sodium hydroxide that it would burn the skin if it touched it, and then it must be autoclaved at a higher temperature for a much longer period of time. Typically, proteases or enzymes that destroy proteins are also added to this mixture. So now that we're finished discussing all the possible types of microorganisms in our class, and we've looked at diseases caused by all of these, I like to show this little diagram that comes from Chapter 7 in your book. It shows you the diseases that we've discussed from least resistant to most resistant. Notice at the bottom, the diseases that are easiest to kill are actually some of the viruses. But this is when the virus is not inside of the body. Once inside of the body, it's much harder to kill a virus. Then we have gram-positive bacteria, more viruses, gram-negative bacteria, then the protozoa. Notice cysts of protozoa, very resistant. Endospores of bacteria, and then of course most resistant on our list are the prions.